Get your hands out of my patient, or I swear to God I will end your career before sunrise. The words hung in the air of Trauma Bay 1 like poison, but the woman with her fist buried inside a dying man's thigh did not even flinch. She did not look up. She did not acknowledge the furious surgeon standing 3 feet away, with a scalpel trembling in his manicured hand. She simply kept her knuckles pressed against the shattered femur, her fingers wrapped around a slippery pulsing tube that was the only thing keeping a 22-year-old man from bleeding out on the table. Blood had splattered across the glass cabinet doors behind her, a grim Jackson Pollock painting in arterial red. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, with that specific frequency that only people on the graveyard shift ever seem to notice, casting everything in a sickly yellow-green glow that made the crimson pooling on the floor look almost black. 3 hours from now, a Navy Black Hawk helicopter would descend on the roof of St. Michael's Memorial Hospital. 8 city blocks would be locked down by federal agents, and the entire staff would learn that the quiet, invisible woman they had spent 7 months ignoring, dismissing, and humiliating was not who she appeared to be. But right now, in this moment, all anyone could see was a mousy nurse with her arm elbow deep in a gunshot wound, while the hospital's star surgeon screamed at her like she was something he had scraped off his expensive Italian shoes. They called her the Ghost. For 7 months, Emily Carter had cleaned bedpans, mopped floors, taken the overnight shifts that nobody wanted, and absorbed abuse from doctors who treated her like furniture with a pulse. She was the new hire, who flinched when attendings raised their voices, the floater nurse who shuffled through the hallways with her shoulders hunched and her eyes fixed permanently on the scuffed linoleum tiles. To the staff of St. Michael's Memorial, she was invisible, pathetic. A timid little creature who somehow passed her nursing boards despite shaking like a leaf every time a trauma case rolled through the doors. They did not know that the trembling was not fear, it was restraint. They did not know that the hands now covered in blood up to the wrists had once held the lives of Tier 1 operators in the mountains of Kandahar. They did not know that the woman they dismissed as weak had performed surgery by flashlight while mortar rounds shook the walls around her. They did not know that she had watched 19 men die and saved 17 more in a single deployment that earned her the Silver Star and cost her everything she loved. And they certainly did not expect what was about to happen. This is the story of how the hospital's invisible woman became its legend. 7 months earlier, Emily Carter had walked through the employee entrance of St. Michael's Memorial Hospital in Boston with a cardboard box containing her new scrubs, a photo of a man she would never see again, and a desperate hope that she could learn how to be normal. The hospital sat on the edge of downtown, like a concrete fortress, its glass facade reflecting the gray November sky and the endless stream of ambulances that pulled into the bay at all hours. It was a level 1 trauma center, which meant it saw the worst of the worst, the gunshot wounds and the car accidents, and the industrial disasters that other hospitals could not handle. It was the kind of place where careers were made and broken in the span of a single shift, where surgeons walked like gods, and nurses learned quickly to stay out of their way. Emily had chosen it specifically because it was nothing like the places she had been before. No sand, no gunfire, no helicopters screaming overhead while she tried to keep a 19-year-old's intestines inside his body. Just fluorescent lights and antiseptic and the mundane rhythm of civilian medicine. That was the theory anyway. The reality was something different. On this particular night, a rainy Tuesday in November, the emergency department hummed with the quiet tension that always preceded chaos. It was 3:47 in the morning, that dead zone between the late-night drunks and the early morning heart attacks when the hallways felt more like a morgue than a hospital. The smell hung heavy in the recycled air, antiseptic, and wet wool from the coats piled by the entrance, stale coffee from the pot that had not been changed since the previous shift. And underneath it all, the faint copper tang of blood that never quite washed away no matter how much bleach the janitorial staff used. Emily stood by the nurse's station, her posture carefully hunched, her eyes fixed on a supply inventory sheet she had already memorized twice. She was 34 years old, though she looked younger, partly because of her genetics, and partly because she had learned long ago how to make herself small enough to disappear. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe bun that was already starting to fray, loose strands escaping to frame a face that would have been striking if she ever let anyone actually look at it. Her scrubs were 2 sizes too large, deliberately chosen to hide the athletic frame underneath. She moved like she was apologizing for taking up space, her footsteps so quiet that other staff members regularly startled when they turned around and found her standing there. It was a performance, of course, all of it. The hunched shoulders, the whispered voice, the way she flinched whenever Dr. Blake raised his voice, which was approximately every 7 minutes. It was a character she had created, a mask she wore so thoroughly that sometimes she forgot where the mask ended and she began. But every performance has cracks. And if anyone had been paying attention, really paying attention, they might have noticed that when a supply cart crashed in the hallway last week, Emily did not jump like everyone else. Instead, her weight shifted instantly to the balls of her feet, her eyes snapped to the exits, and her hands moved toward her waist before she caught herself and forced the startled response that everyone expected. They might have noticed that she could hear whispered conversations from 40 feet away, or that she knew the location of every piece of equipment in the department without having to look, or that the slight tremor in her hands disappeared completely whenever there was actual work to be done. But nobody was paying attention. Nobody ever paid attention to the ghost. The voice that shattered the quiet arrived right on schedule, cutting through the fluorescent hum like a blade through silk. Rhodes, are you deaf or just terminally stupid? Dr. Jonathan Blake, chief of trauma surgery, swept down the corridor with the confidence of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. He was 48 years old, Harvard Medical School class of '99, with a publication record that took up 3 pages of his hospital bio and an ego that took up considerably more space. He was handsome in that polished television doctor way, all sharp jawline and strategic gray at the temples, the kind of man who knew exactly which angle made him look best on camera and positioned himself accordingly. He was also, in Emily's professional opinion, a mediocre surgeon with excellent political instincts and a pathological need to make everyone around him feel small. Tonight, that need was directed at her. I asked for a standard saline drip for the patient in bed 6 over 10 minutes ago, Blake announced, loud enough for the entire department to hear. Why is he still dry? Emily looked up from her inventory sheet, keeping her expression carefully blank. The patient in bed 6 has a history of congestive heart failure. Dr. Blake, his chart was not updated, but I noticed the edema in his ankles when I did his intake. A standard saline load could push fluid into his lungs. I was waiting for you to sign off on a reduced rate. Blake's face went through an interesting series of colors, settling on a shade of red that matched the biohazard bins lining the hallway. The other nurses, Margaret Chen at the main station and Jessica Holloway pretending to organize supplies nearby, stopped what they were doing to watch. This was the nightly entertainment at St. Michael's, the ritual humiliation of whoever Blake decided to target. You noticed Blake laughed, a harsh sound devoid of actual humor. You noticed ankle swelling. Please enlighten me. What prestigious medical school did you attend? I am a nurse, Dr. Blake. I went to nursing school. Community college in Tennessee, according to your file. Blake's smile was the kind that made small animals run for cover, which I suppose explains why you think you are qualified to question a Harvard-trained surgeon about fluid management. Emily said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence was often the most effective weapon, though not in the way Blake intended. Hang the bag, Blake ordered. Standard rate. And the next time you want to play doctor, remember that your job is to follow orders, not to think. He turned and walked away before Emily could respond, which was exactly what he wanted. Victory through volume, superiority through spectacle. The other nurses watched him go with expressions that ranged from relief that they had not been targeted to smug satisfaction that someone else had. Margaret Chen, who had worked at St. Michael's since the Reagan administration and had long since stopped being surprised by anything, shook her head and returned to her paperwork. Jessica Holloway, 24 years old and desperate to climb the social ladder of hospital politics, made eye contact with Emily and smirked. Tough break, she said in a tone that made clear she did not think it was tough at all. Maybe try actually knowing your place next time. Emily did not respond. She simply walked to the supply closet, her movements efficient, despite the shuffling gait she had perfected, and let the heavy door click shut behind her. The supply closet was small and cramped, lined with metal shelving units stacked high with saline bags and gauze and the 1,000 other items that kept a hospital running. The light was dim, a single bulb that cast long shadows across the concrete floor, and the air smelled of plastic packaging and the faint chemical sweetness of sterile supplies. It was also the only place in the entire hospital where Emily allowed herself to stop pretending. The moment the door clicked shut, her posture changed. Her spine straightened, adding 2 inches to her height. Her shoulders rolled back, revealing the athletic frame that the oversized scrubs were meant to hide. The hunched timidity vanished like smoke, replaced by something harder, something colder, something that would have made Blake wet himself if he had ever actually seen it. Her eyes, a piercing blue-gray that she usually kept carefully dulled, sharpened into something predatory. They swept the shelves automatically, cataloging contents and positions, identifying potential weapons and obstacles, assessing the room the way she had been trained to assess every room she entered. Old habits, she thought. Old habits that refused to die no matter how hard she tried to kill them. She closed her eyes and began the breathing exercise that had kept her sane through 2 combat deployments and 3 years of trying to pretend she was someone else. In for 4 counts, hold for 4 counts, out for 4 counts, repeat. It was a technique taught to special operations forces, a way to control the physiological response to stress and bring the heart rate down from combat readiness to something approaching calm. She did not need it, because she was afraid of Blake. That thought was almost funny, but because her body still had not adjusted to the glacial pace of civilian life. After years of operating at full throttle, every nerve ending, screaming at her to move faster, react quicker, be ready for the bullet that could come from anywhere, at any time. The mundane cruelty of hospital politics felt almost unbearable. Not because it hurt, but because it was so pointless, so small. She opened her eyes and looked down at her hands. They were trembling slightly, the way they always did, when the adrenaline had nowhere to go. But the tremor was not weakness. It was energy, with no outlet, a warrior's body trapped in a peacetime cage. The hands themselves told a story that her oversized scrubs could not quite hide. Calloused in unusual places from years of handling weapons and medical equipment in conditions that civilian nurses could not imagine. A scar ran from her left wrist to her elbow, faded now, but still visible, the souvenir of a piece of shrapnel that had come within an inch of severing her radial artery. She grabbed the saline bag she had come for. She would hang it at the reduced rate she knew was correct, and she would adjust the flow regulator when Blake was not looking, and she would add this to the running count. She would kept in her head of all the times she had saved patients from his incompetence without him ever knowing. 3rd time this week. 47th time since she had started. She told herself she was just doing her job. She told herself it did not matter, that no one noticed, that no one cared, that she could save 100 patients, and Blake would still treat her like dirt on his expensive shoes. But something was building. She could feel it, the way she used to feel changes in the weather before a storm rolled over the mountains of Afghanistan. Something was coming. She just did not know yet that it would arrive on a stretcher surrounded by police with a bullet wound in the wrong place and a surgeon too arrogant to see what was right in front of him. The sound came without warning, a helicopter passing over the hospital on its way to somewhere else. It was a routine occurrence in a city like Boston, nothing more than background noise that most people filtered out without conscious thought. Emily's body did not get that memo. The thwap, thwap, thwap of the rotors hit her like a physical blow, and suddenly she was not in a supply closet in Boston anymore. The fluorescent light blurred and shifted, replaced by the harsh white glare of a tactical flashlight. The smell of plastic and antiseptic became dust and cordite, and blood, so much blood, that it soaked through her uniform and dried in the creases of her knuckles. Korangal Valley, Afghanistan. 8 years ago, they called it the Valley of Death, and they were not being dramatic. It was a jagged slash of rock and scrub brush that had swallowed Soviet soldiers and American soldiers with equal indifference, a place where the mountains themselves seemed hostile, and the enemy knew every shadow. Senior Chief Hospital Corpsman Emily Catherine Hayes had been attached to SEAL Team 6 for the operation, providing medical support for a mission that was supposed to be quick and clean. Nothing in the Korangal was ever quick and clean. The ambush came on the 3rd day. RPGs screaming out of the ridgeline, automatic weapons fire from positions they had not detected, the chaos of a perfectly executed trap closing around them like a fist. Within the first 30 seconds, they had lost their primary corpsman to a round through the throat. Within the first minute, Emily had become the only medical personnel left standing. The next 72 hours were the longest of her life. She remembered operating by flashlight while mortar rounds shook dust from the ceiling of the compound they had commandeered. She remembered holding a 19-year-old operator's intestines inside his body cavity with her bare hands while another operator returned fire through a window 3 feet away. She remembered the smell, God, the smell of blood and burned powder, and the sweet, sickly scent of wounds going septic because there was no way to keep anything sterile when the whole world was trying to kill you. She remembered performing a field tracheotomy on Petty Officer Reyes with a combat knife and a ballpoint pen tube because the medkit had been destroyed by shrapnel, and he was drowning in his own blood. And she would be damned if she was going to let another one die. 19 men wounded, 17 saved. But the two she lost, the two she could not save, those were the ones who stayed with her. Those were the faces she saw every time she closed her eyes. Lieutenant Daniel Webb was the last. Danny, her anchor, her reason. The man who had asked her to marry him 3 weeks before the deployment, slipping the ring onto her finger in a hotel room in Virginia Beach, while rain streaked down the windows, and they pretended just for one night that they were normal people with normal lives. The IED that took his legs came on the extraction. A rescue convoy trying to reach their position blown apart 50 meters from the compound gate. Emily had reached him first, sprinting across open ground, while rounds cracked past her head, sliding to her knees beside the man she loved, as his blood pumped into the dust. She had kept him alive for 47 minutes. 47 minutes of pressure and tourniquets and talking, always talking, because she knew that if she stopped talking, he would stop listening, and if he stopped listening, he would stop fighting. And if he stopped fighting, she would lose him. The medevac had arrived at minute 44. They had loaded him onto the helicopter, while she held his hand, still talking, still promising that everything would be okay. He died at minute 47, 3,000 feet in the air, his fingers going slack in her grip as the last of his blood pressure dropped below what the heart could sustain. His final words, whispered through lips that were already turning blue, were the same words she still heard every single day of her life. "Do not stop, Em. There is always one more to save." Emily snapped back to the present, with a gasp that echoed off the supply closet walls. Her face was wet, tears she did not remember crying streaming down her cheeks. Her hands were shaking badly now, not the controlled tremor of excess energy, but the uncontrollable trembling of a nervous system that could not tell the difference between memory and reality. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, forcing her breathing back into the 4-count pattern, fighting her way back to the gray world of fluorescent lights and saline bags, and the petty cruelties of men like Blake. "You do not get to quit," she whispered to the empty room, to Danny, to herself. "There is always one more." She had left the Navy 3 months after his death. Not because she was broken, though she was in ways she was still discovering, but because she was afraid of who she had become. A woman who could watch men die and feel nothing but clinical detachment. A machine made of grief and training that kept functioning long after the human being inside had stopped. St. Michael's was supposed to be her therapy, her purgatory, a place to remember how to be a person instead of a weapon. She was beginning to suspect that some transformations could not be reversed. She grabbed the saline bag, wiped the last of the tears from her face, and opened the door to return to the floor. She did not know that in less than 3 hours, everything would change. She did not know that the war she had tried to leave behind was about to find her. All she knew was that the fluorescent lights were humming, the coffee was terrible, and somewhere out in the rainy Boston night, a man with a bullet in the wrong place was speeding toward her in the back of an ambulance. And she would be ready. She was always ready. The hour between 4 and 5 in the morning had a strange quality in the emergency department, a held breath feeling that experienced staff learned to recognize and dread. It was the quiet before the storm, the moment when the universe seemed to be gathering itself for something terrible. Emily had felt this sensation before, in places where the consequences of ignoring it were measured in body bags instead of overtime hours. She stood at the nurse's station pretending to review patient charts while her instincts screamed at her that something was wrong. The ER was too quiet. The phones were not ringing. Even the usual background noise of monitors and ventilators and shuffling feet seemed muted, as if the hospital itself was holding its breath. She found herself cataloging details without consciously deciding to. The security guard by the main entrance was new, hired within the last month, and he held himself like someone who had never actually had to physically confront a threat. The emergency exit signs had two bulbs burned out maintenance that had been reported 3 times and ignored 3 times because budget cuts had to come from somewhere. The trauma bay supply cabinet was missing 4 units of O-negative blood, which meant someone had used them and not restocked, which meant that if a major trauma came in, they would be scrambling within the first 10 minutes. Old habits, mapping terrain, identifying vulnerabilities. She wondered if she would ever be able to walk into a room without automatically planning how to defend it. You feel it too. The voice came from her left quiet enough that no one else could hear. Emily turned to find Dr. Kevin Park standing beside her, his eyes fixed on the ambulance bay doors, with an expression that suggested he was not entirely sure why he was worried. Kevin was 32, a third-year resident, who had somehow maintained his humanity despite working under Blake for 18 months. He was one of the few people in the department who actually said good morning to Emily, who thanked her when she handed him instruments who seemed to understand that the hierarchies of hospital politics did not have to mean treating people like garbage. Emily liked him as much as she allowed herself to like anyone anymore. Feel what she asked, keeping her voice carefully neutral. I do not know. Kevin frowned at the doors. It is probably nothing. I've just got this weird feeling that something bad is coming. Emily did not tell him that his instincts were exactly right. She did not tell him that she had learned long ago to trust the prickle on the back of her neck, the subtle alarm bells that rang in the lizard brain when danger was approaching. She just nodded and said, probably just the weather. Barometric pressure drops can make people anxious. It was a reasonable explanation. It was also complete nonsense, but Kevin seemed to accept it, offering her a small smile before heading off to check on the patient in bed 4. Emily watched him go, then turned her attention back to the ambulance bay doors. The rain was coming down harder now, sheets of water that turned the parking lot lights into blurry halos. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear sirens. More than one, she realized. Multiple vehicles converging on the same location. The charge nurse's phone rang. Margaret Chen answered it, and Emily watched the color drain from her face in real time. Mass casualty, Margaret said. Into the phone, her voice carefully controlled. How many? And the critical, what is his status? She hung up and reached for the overhead intercom, her hand not quite steady. All available staff to the ER. Incoming trauma, GSW, to the chest ET. 4 minutes. Additional casualties en route. The quiet shattered like glass. Staff materialized from break rooms and supply closets, the night shift shuffle replaced by the controlled urgency of people who had done this hundreds of times before. Trauma bays where cleared equipment was positioned, the choreography of emergency medicine spinning up like an engine coming to life. Blake swept in from wherever he had been hiding, his white coat billowing behind him like a cape, his face arranged in the expression of calm authority that he practiced in the mirror. What do we have? Gunshot wound to the chest, male, early 20s, Margaret reported. Police pursuit vehicle crashed. He is the driver. There were 2 officers also injured but stable. He is the critical. Blake nodded, already moving toward Trauma Bay 1. Get it set up for a thoracotomy. If he is tamponading, I will need to crack him open. Emily fell into position against the wall of the Trauma Bay, invisible as always, watching the preparations unfold with eyes that missed nothing. She noted the positioning of the crash cart, the location of the surgical instruments, the sight lines to the door. She noted which staff members were focused and which were nervous, who would be useful in a crisis and who would freeze. And she waited. The ambulance bay doors exploded inward, as if they had been kicked by a giant. And suddenly, the quiet tension of the past hour converted itself into pure, concentrated chaos. 2 paramedics burst through the opening, pushing a gurney that seemed to be more blood than patient. They were flanked by 4 police officers. 2 of them visibly injured themselves, all of them shouting information that overlapped into an incomprehensible wall of sound. GSW male 22, hit in the chest and maybe the leg. We could not tell, there was so much blood. Suspect in a police pursuit crashed his vehicle on the interstate. BP was 80/50 when we loaded him. It has been dropping. Needs surgery. Now he is dying. The gurney crashed through the doors of Trauma Bay 1, and Emily got her first clear look at the patient. He was young, heartbreakingly young with a face that probably looked boyish and charming when it was not gray and slack with blood loss. Handcuffs secured his wrists to the rails of the gurney, a reminder that whatever else he was also a suspect in something serious enough to warrant a police chase. His shirt had been cut away by the paramedics, revealing a gunshot wound in his upper chest that was bleeding freely, the dark red of venous blood mixing with the brighter arterial spray. But that was not what caught Emily's attention. What caught Emily's attention was the blood pooling under the gurney, not from the chest wound, which was positioned wrong to be draining downward. From somewhere lower, somewhere the paramedics had not noticed because the patient's dark jeans were hiding the saturation. The leg, she thought. They said maybe the leg. There was no maybe about it. She could see the wet gleam where the denim was soaked through, could see the way the blood was spreading across the white floor tiles in a pattern that told her everything she needed to know about what was happening underneath those jeans. Femoral artery, severed or at minimum torn. At the current rate of blood loss, the patient had less than 3 minutes before his brain started to die from oxygen deprivation. Maybe less. Blake did not see it. Blake was focused on the chest wound, the dramatic injury, the one that would look good in an article or a presentation. He was already calling for a thoracotomy tray, preparing to crack the patient's chest open to access the heart and the major vessels. He is tamponating, Blake announced with complete confidence. The blood is compressing the heart. We need to relieve the pressure. Get me a 10-blade and the rib spreader. Emily opened her mouth to speak. Doctor, the leg. I said, get me the instruments, Blake snapped, without turning around. And someone get that nurse out of my trauma bay. She is in the way. Emily looked at the floor. She looked at the clock. She looked at the patient whose face was going from gray to blue, whose eyes were starting to roll back, whose life was measured in seconds now, not minutes. She looked at Blake, who was reaching for a scalpel with hands that had no idea they were about to kill a man. 2 minutes and 30 seconds. She did not make a decision. Not really. Decisions imply thought consideration, the weighing of options. What happened instead was something deeper, something that bypassed the conscious mind entirely and went straight to the muscle memory that had been burned into her nervous system by years of operating in conditions that made this trauma bay look like a luxury spa. She moved. Later, the witnesses would struggle to describe what they saw. The words they used were blur and impossible and like something out of a movie, which did not capture it at all, but was the best their civilian minds could manage. One moment, Emily Carter was standing against the wall invisible and ignored the ghost who haunted the edges of the department without ever really being part of it. The next moment, she was at the foot of the gurney. She did not ask for permission. She did not wait for orders. She did not pause to consider the consequences for her career, her cover, her carefully constructed identity as a timid nobody who followed the rules and never made waves. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a pair of trauma shears, heavy-duty medical scissors that she had carried on her person every single shift for 7 months without ever needing to explain why. And in one fluid motion that spoke of training and practice and hundreds of repetitions under the worst conditions imaginable, she cut the patient's jeans from the knee to the hip. The blood that erupted was nothing short of spectacular. It came out in a geyser, a fountain of bright arterial red that sprayed across the cabinet doors and the floor, and the pristine white of Blake's coat. The other nurses screamed. One of the police officers stumbled backward, his hand going to his weapon out of pure reflex. Blake dropped his scalpel, the metal clattering against the tray with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. Emily did not flinch. She did not hesitate. She did what she had done dozens of times in places where hesitation meant death, and medical supplies came from whatever you could scavenge from the wreckage. She put her fist directly into the wound. Her hand plunged into the torn muscle and shattered vessels of the patient's inner thigh, guided by nothing but touch and experience, and the desperate knowledge that somewhere in this mess of blood and tissue was an artery that needed to be stopped right now. Her fingers found it, the slippery pulsing tube of the femoral artery, and she clamped down with her knuckles against the femur bone, creating a seal through pure pressure. The fountain of blood stopped. The monitors, which had been screaming alarms, began to stabilize. The heart rate steadied. The blood pressure, which had been crashing towards zero, began to tick upward. Femoral artery, Emily said. Her voice was different, not the soft mumble of the ghost, the voice that apologized for existing and faded into the background. This voice was flat and commanding, the voice of someone who had shouted orders over gunfire and expected them to be obeyed. Severed approximately 2 inches below the inguinal ligament. He was not tamponating, he was bleeding out from the leg. The chest wound is superficial, by comparison, probably did not even nick the lung. She looked up at Blake for the first time, and the expression on her face made him take an involuntary step backward. If you had cracked his chest, she continued, her tone utterly devoid of emotion. The drop in thoracic pressure would have accelerated the blood loss from the femoral. He would have been dead in 90 seconds, maybe less. The silence in the trauma bay was absolute. Even the monitors seemed to have quieted, their beeping muted, as if they too were afraid to make a sound. Blake stared at Emily at her bloody arm, disappearing into the patient's thigh at the crimson handprints she had left on the gurney rails. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. For the first time in his entire career, he had absolutely nothing to say. Clamp, Emily said. It was not a request. Vascular clamp, now. And someone get a surgical team in here. He needs the artery repaired before I can let go. Margaret Chen moved first, breaking the spell that had frozen the room. She handed Blake the clamp, and after a long moment of staring at it, like he had never seen such an instrument before, the surgeon stepped forward to take over. Emily guided his hands into position, showing him exactly where to place the clamp, exactly how much pressure to apply. When she was satisfied that the artery was secure, she slowly withdrew her fist from the wound, watching carefully for any resumption of bleeding. There was none. She stepped back from the gurney, holding her bloody hands up in the sterile pose that was pure reflex, and looked down at herself. Her scrubs were soaked from the chest down. There was blood in her hair, on her face, probably in her shoes. She looked like she had just walked out of a horror movie. She felt more like herself than she had in 3 years. Get him to surgery, she said quietly. He is going to need at least 4 units of blood, probably more. Type and cross. Before you transfuse, the cops probably do not know his blood type, and you do not want to kill him with an incompatibility reaction after all this. Nobody moved. They were all still staring at her, their expressions ranging from shock to awe to something that looked almost like fear. Now, Emily added with just enough edge to make it clear that she was not asking. The room exploded into action. The patient, whose name turned out to be Marcus Webb, no relation to anyone Emily had ever known, despite the coincidence that made her heart clench, was rushed to surgery and stabilized within the hour. He would live. He would probably even walk again, though, with a significant limp. The charges against him, it turned out, were relatively minor, a string of car thefts that had spiraled out of control when he panicked at a traffic stop. He was a stupid kid who had made stupid choices, not a hardened criminal. None of that mattered in the moment. What mattered was the silence that followed Emily as she walked to the sink and began washing the blood from her hands and arms. The trauma bay had been cleared of everyone except essential personnel, but she could feel the eyes on her through the glass walls. The entire department had gathered in the hallway, doctors and nurses and techs, and even a few patients who were mobile enough to rubberneck, all of them watching the woman who had just saved a life with her bare hands. The woman they had thought was pathetic. The woman they had dismissed and mocked and ignored. Margaret Chen was the first to approach her. The charge nurse moved slowly, like someone approaching a wild animal they were not sure was friendly, and stopped about 5 feet away. "How did you know?" Margaret asked. Her voice was quiet, but there was something underneath it, a recognition that went beyond simple curiosity. The blood was not even visible on his jeans. The paramedics missed it. Blake missed it. How did you know it was arterial? Emily continued washing her hands, watching the pink water swirl down the drain. The pooling pattern on the floor, she said. Venous blood spreads evenly. Arterial blood pulses with the heartbeat. It creates a specific spatter pattern. I have seen it before. Where? Emily was quiet for a long moment. A place where getting the diagnosis wrong meant people died. Margaret nodded slowly, and Emily could see the understanding dawn in her eyes. I was Army Nurse Corps, Margaret said quietly. Vietnam, 1971. Different war, same lessons. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. She simply reached out and put a hand on Emily's shoulder, a brief touch that communicated more than words ever could, and then walked away to manage the chaos that was erupting in the department. Emily finished washing her hands and dried them on a paper towel, taking her time using the mechanical action to center herself. The adrenaline was fading now, leaving behind the familiar emptiness that always followed a crisis. The high of the fight followed by the crash of the aftermath. She became aware of someone standing behind her and turned to find Kevin Park watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "You have done that before," he said. "Not a question." Emily looked at him for a long moment, weighing options, calculating risks. Then she nodded once. "More times than I can count." Kevin did not push for details. He just stood there, processing what he had witnessed, recalibrating everything he thought he knew about the quiet nurse who never made eye contact. "Blake is going to make your life hell," he said finally. "You know that, right? You just showed him up in front of the entire department. He is never going to forgive that." Emily almost smiled. He was going to make my life hell anyway. At least now there is a reason. Before Kevin could respond, the trauma bay doors swung open and Blake himself stormed in. His face was a mottled purple, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had changed out of his blood-soaked coat, but he still looked disheveled in a way that Emily suspected horrified him. "You," he said, pointing at Emily, "my office. Now." Emily turned to face him, and something in her expression made him hesitate despite his rage. "After I finish my documentation," she said calmly, "the patient needs accurate records, and right now, I am the only one who knows exactly what interventions were performed and in what order." Blake's face went through several more interesting colors. For a moment, Emily thought he might actually explode right there in the trauma bay. But then, Margaret Chen appeared at his elbow, murmuring something about press inquiries and hospital liability. And the prospect of looking bad in the media seemed to override his desire for immediate revenge. "My office," he repeated. "The moment you are finished. Do not even think about leaving the building." He turned and stalked away, and Emily returned to her documentation with hands that were perfectly steady. She had approximately 2 hours before everything changed. The locker room was empty at 6:23 in the morning, most of the night shift having already left and the day shift not yet arrived to claim the space. Emily sat on the bench in front of her locker, staring at nothing, letting the silence wash over her like a physical thing. Her hands had finally started to shake. Not during the crisis, of course. Never during the crisis. Her body knew better than to betray her when lives were on the line. But now, in the aftermath, with the adrenaline fully metabolized, and nothing left to do but wait for the consequences, the tremors were making up for lost time. She had blown her cover. 7 months of careful invisibility of building a character so thoroughly unremarkable that no one would ever look twice at her gone in the span of 3 minutes. By now, the story would be spreading through the hospital like wildfire. By tomorrow, it would be on the local news. By next week, someone would start asking questions that she could not answer. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and looked at the screen. Unknown number, which normally would have meant spam except that she recognized the area code. Virginia. Specifically, the Naval Special Warfare Development Group headquarters in Virginia Beach. Her hand tightened around the phone. She let it ring twice more before answering. "This is Hayes." The name came out automatically, the name she had not used in 3 years. Silence on the other end, just long enough to make her wonder if she had made a mistake. Then a voice she would have recognized anywhere, a voice that had ordered her into combat zones and pinned medals on her chest and begged her not to resign. Emily. Admiral Thomas Hartley sounded older than she remembered, more tired. "I was not sure you would answer." "I was not sure I would either." "Fair enough." A pause filled with the weight of things unsaid. "I am not going to ask how you are doing. I have been getting reports." Of course he had. The Navy did not let assets like Emily simply disappear into civilian life without keeping tabs. She had suspected she was being monitored. It was almost a relief to have it confirmed. "Then, you know I blew my cover tonight," she said. "So, if this is a social call, your timing is either very good or very bad." "It is not a social call." Hartley's voice shifted, taking on the tone she remembered from mission briefings. The tone that meant people's lives were on the line. "I need you, Emily. We need you." "I am retired. You are on inactive reserve, which means I can recall you if the situation warrants." He paused. "The situation warrants." Emily closed her eyes, pressing the phone hard against her ear. She had known this moment would come eventually. She had just hoped it would be later. Much later. Maybe never. "What happened?" Hartley told her. "A SEAL team operating in a location that he could not name over an unsecured line. An ambush that had killed 2 operators and wounded 4 more, including 1 critical. The team surgeon had been among the casualties. They needed someone who could perform battlefield surgery in austere conditions, Someone who had done it before. Someone who could be trusted to keep operators alive long enough to get them to a real hospital. There was only one person on the eastern seaboard who fit all those criteria and could be mobilized in time. The critical Emily said, her voice steady, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. How bad? Bad. Gunshot wound to the abdomen, shrapnel in the chest. His teammates have him stabilized, but he needs surgery within 4 hours, or he is not going to make it. We cannot extract him without a surgeon on site. The transport time is too long. What is his name? Petty Officer Second Class Ryan Mitchell. He is 24 years old. Emily. He has got a girl back home waiting for him. Emily opened her eyes and looked at herself in the mirror mounted on the locker room wall. She saw a woman with blood still dried in the creases of her knuckles, a woman who had spent 3 years trying to convince herself she was someone else. She saw Danny too. She always saw Danny. There is always one more to save. When do we leave? She heard herself say. Hartley exhaled relief, visible in the lines of his face. The helicopter is standing by. We can be wheels up in 10 minutes. She hung up without saying goodbye. She looked at the mirror for a long moment, at the ghost she had created, and the warrior who had never really gone away. Then she opened her locker, pulled out the go bag she had packed on her first day, and never actually expected to use, and walked out the door. The sound reached the emergency department before anyone saw its source, a distant throbbing that grew rapidly into the unmistakable thunder of military rotors. Staff members looked up from their work conversations, trailed off mid-sentence, and a curious tension spread through the building, like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. The morning shift was just arriving, coffee cups in hand, faces still soft with sleep. They walked into a department that had been transformed overnight, where the graveyard crew spoke in hushed voices about things they could not quite believe they had witnessed, where the name Emily Carter was being repeated with a reverence that would have seemed laughable 24 hours ago. None of them were prepared for what happened next. The helicopter appeared over the Boston skyline at 6:47 a.m. A Navy MH-60S Blackhawk, in full military configuration. It was not a medical transport, anyone with eyes could see that. It was an assault variant, equipped for operations that civilians were not supposed to know about, painted in colors that seemed to absorb the morning light. It circled the hospital once, then descended directly onto the roof. On the ground, chaos erupted. Police cars materialized from seemingly nowhere, sealing off 8 blocks in every direction without warning or explanation. Hospital security rushed to the main entrance, demanding answers that no one was authorized to give. Local news vans appeared within minutes, cameras pointed at the sky, reporters speculating wildly about terrorist threats and VIP patients and federal operations. Dr. Jonathan Blake pushed his way to the front of the crowd gathering in the lobby, his face a mask of excited anticipation. This was his moment, he clearly believed. Whatever was happening, it was big, and he intended to position himself at the center of it. What is going on? He demanded of a security guard. Why was I not notified? I am the chief of trauma surgery. Any major incident should come through my department. The security guard did not answer. He was staring at the elevator where the numbers above the door were counting down from the roof. The doors opened. 4 men in dark suits emerged first, spreading out, with the practiced efficiency of federal agents who did this sort of thing regularly. They wore earpieces and sunglasses and expressions that suggested they would be very happy to shoot anyone who gave them a reason. Behind them came 2 Navy officers in dress whites, their uniforms immaculate, their chests heavy with ribbons that most civilians would not be able to identify. And in the center of the formation, walking with a measured cadence that clicked against the linoleum floor like a heartbeat, was a woman. She was not wearing scrubs. She was not wearing the oversized, stained uniform of the janitorial staff. She was wearing a tailored, navy blue dress uniform, crisp and decorated, that fit her like it had been designed for precisely this moment. Her blonde hair was down, cascading over her shoulders in sleek, golden waves, no longer hidden in a frizzy bun that made her look smaller than she was. She walked with perfect posture, shoulders back, chin raised, every inch the warrior she had tried so hard to pretend she was not. It took the gathered crowd several seconds to process what they were seeing. Margaret Chen figured it out first, her hand going to her mouth in an expression of shock and sudden understanding. Jessica Holloway gasped, an audible intake of breath that drew irritated looks from the agents. Kevin Park smiled a small private expression that suggested he was not entirely surprised. And Dr. Jonathan Blake went absolutely white. Rhodes, he whispered the name coming out strangled. That is not possible. But it was possible. It was happening. The ghost, the mouse, the invisible woman who had spent 7 months absorbing his abuse without a word of complaint was walking toward him in a uniform that commanded more respect than he had ever earned in his entire career. The name on her badge did not say Emily Carter. It said MCPO, Emily C. Hayes USN, and underneath that, in smaller letters, that Blake had to squint to read Silver Star, Bronze Star, Purple Heart. The formation stopped when Emily was 5 feet from Blake, close enough that he could see the medals on her chest, the ribbons that represented things he could not begin to understand. Dr. Blake, she said, and her voice was the same voice that had commanded the trauma bay 3 hours ago, the voice that expected to be obeyed. I trust you have been keeping my department running smoothly. Blake made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had contained any actual humor. Your department. Miss Carter. I do not know what kind of game you are playing, but you abandoned your post. I filed termination paperwork the moment you disappeared. You do not work here anymore. Emily tilted her head slightly, a gesture that reminded several onlookers of a predator, deciding whether its prey was worth the effort of a chase. Actually, she said I never worked here in the first place. Not in the way you think. She turned to the older man in the navy uniform beside her, a terrifying figure, built like a tank with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. Admiral, would you mind explaining the situation? Admiral Hartley stepped forward, and even Blake, who respected nothing and no one, found himself shrinking back from the sheer weight of authority the man projected. Dr. Blake Hartley, said his voice like gravel being fed through a garbage disposal. Master Chief Hayes has been on detached duty at this facility as part of a Navy transition program for combat veterans. She was placed here for observation and decompression following her retirement from active operations. Our understanding was that she would be provided with a low-stress environment to support her reintegration into civilian life. He paused, letting the implications sink in. Instead, we have documented evidence of consistent workplace harassment, verbal abuse, and professional misconduct directed at a decorated veteran with over 20 years of combat medical experience. The Navy takes a very dim view of how our people are treated, Dr. Blake. A very dim view indeed. Blake's face went from white to gray. I did not know. I had no idea. Ignorance is not a defense, Admiral Hartley cut him off, particularly when the behavior in question would be unacceptable regardless of the victim's background. He reached into his leather folio and produced a stack of papers. Effective immediately, your medical license is suspended pending a full investigation. Your privileges at this hospital are revoked. You will surrender your credentials to hospital security and vacate the premises within the hour. You cannot do this, Blake sputtered. I have tenure. I have rights. I will sue. You are welcome to try, Emily said quietly. But I should warn you that the evidence against you is extensive. Security footage, witness statements, incident reports. Every time you humiliated a nurse or falsified a record or prioritized your ego over patient safety, someone was watching. Someone was documenting. She took a step closer and Blake actually flinched. I spent 7 months watching you, Gregory. I watched you endanger patients. I watched you destroy careers. I watched you create a culture of fear that made everyone in this department worse at their jobs because they were too scared of you to speak up. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. And I fixed things. Quietly. Invisibly. 47 times in 7 months I corrected your mistakes before they killed someone. You never knew. You never even suspected. Because you never looked at me long enough to see anything but a convenient target for your insecurities. She straightened up and stepped back, her expression shifting from cold fury to something almost like pity. Your career is over, Dr. Blake. Not because of me, but because of you. Everything that is happening right now is the direct result of choices you made every single day to be cruel instead of kind. Blake stood there, surrounded by the shattered remains of his reputation, and for the first time in his life, he had absolutely nothing to say. 2 security guards appeared at his elbows, waiting to escort him from the building. He went with them without resistance, his shoulders slumped, his expensive shoes dragging against the floor. Emily watched him go, then turned to face the crowd that had gathered to witness his downfall. Doctors and nurses and techs and patients, all of them staring at her with expressions that ranged from awe to confusion to something that looked almost like hope. I have to go, she said, addressing no one in particular. There is someone who needs my help, but I want you all to know something. She paused, making sure she had their attention. Every person in this building matters. Every job matters. The surgeon and the janitor, the attending and the intern, the patient and the person who cleans their room. We are all part of the same mission, which is keeping people alive. And anyone who forgets that anyone who thinks their title gives them the right to treat others as less than human. She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Take care of each other, she said. I will be back when I can. Then she turned and walked toward the elevator, the formation closing around her, leaving behind a department that would never be quite the same. The conference room on the third floor of St. Michael's had been commandeered by the Navy within minutes of the helicopter's arrival. Its usual occupants of hospital administrators and department heads politely but firmly relocated to somewhere else. Emily sat at the head of the long table, still in her dress uniform, while Admiral Hartley spread classified documents across the polished wood surface. Here is what we know, Hartley said, his voice low, despite the room being swept for listening devices twice already. 12 hours ago, a six-man SEAL team was conducting a reconnaissance operation in a location I cannot name. They were ambushed during extraction. 2 killed in action, 4 wounded, one of them critical. Emily looked at the photograph spread before her. Satellite imagery of terrain that could have been anywhere in a dozen countries, medical reports, with sections blacked out, personnel files with faces she did not recognize, but expressions she knew intimately. The look of men who had seen things that would never fully leave them. The team surgeon was one of the KIAs, Hartley continued. Lieutenant Commander Peters, good man, took a round through the neck in the first 30 seconds of the ambush. Emily closed her eyes briefly. She had not known Peters personally, but she knew the type. Dedicated, skilled. The kind of person who volunteered for deployments that most doctors would run from. The critical patient is Petty Officer Second Class Ryan Mitchell, Hartley said, sliding a photograph across the table. 24 years old, 3 deployments, exemplary service record. He took a round through the abdomen and caught shrapnel from a grenade in his chest. His teammates have him stabilized with field dressings and prayer, but he needs surgery within the next 4 hours, or the internal bleeding is going to kill him. Emily picked up the photograph. Ryan Mitchell had a young face, open and earnest, the kind of face that probably smiled easily and often. He looked like the boys she had saved in Kandahar. He looked like the boys she had lost. He looked like Danny. Why cannot you extract him to a hospital, she asked, though she already knew the answer. Transport time is too long. The nearest surgical facility is 6 hours away, by the fastest route available. If we move him without stabilizing the internal bleeding first, he dies in transit. If we do not move him at all, he dies where he is. Hartley's jaw tightened. We need someone who can operate in the field, someone who can perform surgery in a moving helicopter with limited equipment and no backup. Someone who has done it before and brought patients home alive. There was only one person on the eastern seaboard who fit all those criteria and could be mobilized in time. The critical, Emily said, her voice steady even as her heart hammered against her ribs. How bad? Bad. Gunshot wound to the abdomen, shrapnel in the chest. His teammates have him stabilized, but he needs surgery within 4 hours, or he is not going to make it. We cannot extract him without a surgeon on site. The transport time is too long. What is his name? Petty Officer Second Class Ryan Mitchell. He is 24 years old, Emily. He has got a girl back home waiting for him. Emily looked at the photograph again. Ryan Mitchell, 24 years old, with a girl back home waiting for him. A whole life ahead of him if someone could keep him alive long enough to live it. She thought about the 3 years she had spent trying to convince herself she was done with this life. The therapy sessions and the medication and the carefully constructed identity of a woman who did not carry the weight of the dead on her shoulders. She thought about how good it had felt just a few hours ago to stop pretending and let herself be who she really was. She thought about Danny and the promise she had made to him as he died in her arms. There is always one more to save. When do we leave? She heard herself say. Hartley exhaled relief, visible in the lines of his face. The helicopter is standing by. We can be wheels up in 10 minutes. I need to grab my gear. And I need to say goodbye to a few people. You have 5 minutes. It would have to be enough. The hallway outside the conference room had cleared of most of the spectators, but a small group remained clustered near the elevator, as if waiting for something they could not quite name. Emily recognized them immediately. Margaret Chen, standing with her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. Kevin Park, still in his scrubs, looking like he had not slept in days. And Jessica Holloway hovering uncertainly at the edge of the group like she was not sure she belonged there. Emily walked toward them, and something shifted in the air as she approached. These were the people who had witnessed her transformation, who had seen the ghost become something else entirely. They deserved at least a moment of explanation, even if she could not give them the whole truth. Margaret stepped forward first. The older nurse had changed out of her work clothes and was wearing a simple cardigan over slacks, but she carried herself with the same quiet authority she always had. Without a word, she reached into her pocket and pulled out something small and metallic, a St. Christopher medal on a thin silver chain worn smooth by years of handling. My brother gave this to me when I shipped out to Vietnam, Margaret said, pressing the medal into Emily's palm. It kept me safe for 2 tours. I want you to have it. Emily looked at the medal, feeling the weight of history in her hand. Margaret, I cannot take this. It is yours. It is mine to give. Margaret's eyes were bright, but her voice was steady. Bring yourself back, Emily. That is all I ask. Bring yourself back. Emily closed her fingers around the medal and nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Kevin was next. He approached with his hands in his pockets, looking younger than his 32 years, looking like a man who had just realized that the world was bigger and stranger than he had ever imagined. I knew there was something different about you, he said quietly, from the first day. I just could not figure out what it was. You were one of the only people here who treated me like a human being, Emily replied. That matters more than you know. What do I do now? Kevin asked. With Blake gone, with everything changing, what do I do? Emily put a hand on his shoulder. You become the doctor this place needs. You stand up for the nurses and the techs and the patients who cannot stand up for themselves. You do not let the Blakes of the world win. Kevin nodded slowly. I can do that. I know you can. That is why I am asking. The last goodbye was the hardest. Jessica Holloway stood apart from the others, her arms wrapped around herself, her face a complicated mixture of shame and something that might have been hope. She had been one of Emily's cruelest tormentors, giggling at Blake's jokes, adding her own barbs whenever the opportunity arose. But she was also young, young enough to change, young enough to become something better than she had been. Emily walked over to her, and Jessica flinched as if expecting a blow. Instead, Emily simply looked at her for a long moment, seeing the fear underneath the bravado, the insecurity that had made cruelty feel like safety. We all wear masks, Emily said finally. The question is what we do when we take them off. Jessica's eyes filled with tears. I am sorry. I am so sorry. I did not know. I never thought. I know. Emily's voice was gentle. That is the point, Jessica. You never thought. None of you did. But now you can. Now you can look at the quiet person in the corner and wonder what their story is. Now you can choose to be kind instead of cruel. She turned and walked toward the elevator where the federal agents were waiting impatiently. She did not look back. Some doors once opened could never be closed, but some doors led to places worth going. The helicopter lifted off from the roof of St. Michael's Memorial at 7:15 a.m., climbing into a sky that was just beginning to brighten from gray to gold. Emily sat in the jump seat, her go bag at her feet, her mind already running through the procedures she might need to perform with equipment that would be laughably inadequate by civilian standards. The crew chief, a grizzled senior chief named Morrison, who had clearly been doing this since before Emily was born, handed her a headset so she could communicate over the roar of the rotors. 3 hours to the rendezvous point, Morrison shouted into the mic. We will link up with the extraction team, grab your patient, and get the hell out. Simple. Nothing was ever simple, Emily thought. But she just nodded and began checking her medical kit for the 4th time. The flight was a blur of noise and vibration, and the peculiar timelessness that came with traveling toward danger. Emily used the hours to review Ryan Mitchell's medical file, memorizing his blood type and allergies, and the details of his wounds as reported by his teammates. She visualized the procedures she might need to perform, walking through each step in her mind, until they felt as natural as breathing. She had done this before, she could do it again. The terrain below shifted from urban sprawl to rural farmland, to something wilder and more desolate. They crossed water at some point, then mountains, then a landscape that Emily recognized from her previous deployments, even though she could not have named the country if asked. 5 minutes, Morrison announced. Prep for hot extraction. The helicopter began its descent toward a clearing that was barely visible through the dust being kicked up by the rotors. Emily could see figures on the ground, men in tactical gear waving them in and beyond them. A makeshift shelter constructed from camouflage netting and whatever materials they had been able to scavenge. The skids touched earth, and Emily was moving before they fully settled. She grabbed her kit and ran, keeping low beneath the spinning blades, heading for the shelter where a cluster of men were gathered around a prone figure. She recognized the look on their faces, the desperate hope of men who had done everything they could and knew it was not enough. Chief Hayes. One of them stepped forward, a massive operator with blood on his hands and exhaustion carved into every line of his face. Thank God, he is in here. The shelter was barely large enough to stand in, lit by tactical flashlights that cast harsh shadows across the improvised operating space. Ryan Mitchell lay on a stretcher in the center, his face gray, his breathing shallow, surrounded by the detritus of field medicine bloody bandages. Empty morphine syrettes, IV bags that had been hung from netting hooks. Emily dropped to her knees beside him and began her assessment. The abdominal wound was worse than the reports had suggested. The bullet had entered just below the ribs and traveled upward, perforating the liver and probably nicking the inferior vena cava. The field dressings his teammates had applied were soaked through with dark blood, and his abdomen was rigid with internal swelling. The shrapnel in his chest was a secondary concern, fragments that had embedded in the intercostal muscles without penetrating the lung cavity. Painful and dangerous if left untreated, but not immediately fatal. The liver was the priority. The liver was what would kill him in the next hour if she did not stop the bleeding. I need light, Emily said, her voice calm despite the adrenaline flooding her system. All of it. And someone hold this retractor. The operators moved to comply, their training overriding their exhaustion. They had been awake for over 20 hours, had watched two of their brothers die, and were running on nothing but determination and the faint hope that this woman could perform a miracle. Emily intended to give them one. She worked by flashlight and instinct, her hands remembering procedures that her conscious mind did not need to guide. She opened the abdominal wound wider, irrigated the cavity with saline, and found the bleeder a ragged tear in the liver tissue that was pumping blood with every weak beat of Ryan's heart. She clamped it, sutured it, clamped another. The minutes blurred together, marked only by the steady beeping of the portable monitor and the occasional distant sound of gunfire that reminded her where she was. Halfway through the procedure, Ryan's heart stopped. The monitor flatlined, the steady beep becoming a continuous tone that Emily had heard too many times in too many places. The operators froze, their faces going pale beneath the dirt and blood. Emily did not freeze. She never froze. She began compressions immediately, her hands finding the rhythm automatically, while her mind calculated survival probabilities and intervention options. She could not do proper CPR without stopping the surgery, but she could not let his heart stay stopped either. Come on, Ryan, she said, her voice low and fierce. You do not get to quit. Not today. Not like this. She grabbed the emergency defibrillator from her kit, charged it, and pressed the paddles to his chest. The shock made his body jerk, but the monitor remained flat. Again, she said to no one in particular. She charged and shocked again. Nothing. You are going home, Ryan. You are going home to that girl who is waiting for you. You are going to marry her and have kids and grow old and tell stories to your grandkids about the time you almost died in a place nobody can pronounce. She charged the paddles a third time. But you have to fight. You have to stay with me. She shocked him again. The monitor beeped. Once, twice. Then a rhythm weak, but present, the unmistakable pattern of a heart that had decided to keep beating. Emily let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, and returned to the surgery, with hands that remained perfectly steady despite the tears streaming down her face. 37 minutes later, she tied off the final suture and stepped back from the stretcher. Ryan Mitchell was alive, stabilized, ready for transport. Get him on the helicopter, she said, and pray the flight is smooth. The operators lifted the stretcher with a gentleness that belied their size and combat training, carrying their brother toward the waiting aircraft. Emily followed her kit in one hand, and the St. Christopher medal clutched in the other. She had kept her promise. There had been one more to save, and against all odds, she had saved him. 72 hours later, Emily stepped off a military transport at Logan Airport and took her first breath of Boston air in 3 days. It tasted like exhaust and rain, and something that might have been home if she still believed in such things. Ryan Mitchell was alive. He was in a military hospital in Germany now, recovering from the surgery that had saved his life, scheduled for transfer to Walter Reed within the week. His prognosis was good. He would walk again, fight again, if he chose live the life that had been on the verge of slipping away on that stretcher in a nameless clearing. Emily had stayed with him until the handoff to the surgical team in Germany, watching over him during the long flight, monitoring his vitals, talking to him even though he could not hear her. She had told him about Danny, about Kandahar, about the promise she had made, and the weight she carried. She did not know why. Maybe she just needed to say it out loud to someone who would not remember. Now she was back in Boston, standing on the tarmac in civilian clothes, feeling the strange dislocation of returning to a world that had continued spinning without her. Admiral Hartley had offered her a ride to wherever she wanted to go. She had declined, wanting the time alone to process everything that had happened. She took a cab to St. Michael's. The hospital looked the same as it always had: concrete and glass and the endless stream of ambulances. But something felt different as she walked through the employee entrance. Something she could not quite identify until she realized what it was. People were looking at her, not through her the way they had for 7 months. At her, making eye contact, nodding acknowledgement, some of them even smiling. The ghost had been seen, and the seeing had changed something fundamental in the way the hospital understood itself. Margaret Chen found her in the break room, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. "You look like hell," Margaret said, sitting down across from her. "I feel like hell," Emily admitted. "But the good kind." "Is there a good kind?" "The kind where you are exhausted because you did something that mattered. That kind." Margaret nodded slowly, understanding in her eyes. "The young man you went to save. Is he alive?" "Alive, recovering, going to be fine." "Good." Margaret reached across the table and squeezed Emily's hand. "That is good." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, two women who had seen too much and carried too much, and somehow kept going anyway. Outside the break room window, the sun was setting over Boston, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed almost impossibly beautiful. "What happens now?" Margaret asked finally. Emily looked at her coffee, at her hands, at the fading light outside. "I do not know," she said honestly. "For the first time in 3 years, I do not know what comes next. And I think that might be okay." 2 weeks later, Emily stood in front of a mirror in her apartment, barely recognizing the woman staring back at her. The Navy had insisted on a formal recognition ceremony, the kind of event that she had avoided her entire career, preferring to let her work speak for itself rather than stand on stages accepting praise. But this time, she had agreed. Not for herself, but for Ryan, for Danny, for all the ones she had saved and all the ones she could not. She wore a red dress. It was elegant and fitted nothing like the oversized scrubs she had hidden inside for 7 months. Nothing like the tactical gear she had worn into combat zones. It was the dress of a woman who had stopped apologizing for existing, who had stopped trying to disappear into walls and backgrounds. Her blonde hair cascaded over her shoulders in golden waves, no longer scraped back in a punishing bun. She wore heels that would click against floors and announce her presence instead of the soft-soled shoes that let her move like a ghost. She looked for the first time in years like someone who wanted to be seen. The ceremony was held in the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Copley, filled with Navy brass and hospital administrators and the St. Michael's staff who had witnessed her transformation. Emily walked in on Admiral Hartley's arm, and the room fell silent. She saw Margaret Chen in the crowd, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. She saw Kevin Park, beaming like a proud younger brother. She saw Jessica Holloway, who had transformed over the past 2 weeks into someone Emily barely recognized. Someone who volunteered for extra shifts and defended junior nurses and seemed to be genuinely trying to become better. She even saw Dr. Blake hovering at the back of the room, having somehow obtained an invitation despite his disgrace. He looked smaller than she remembered, diminished, a man forced to confront the consequences of his own cruelty. She felt no satisfaction at his presence, only a distant pity. The medal they pinned on her chest was her fourth, though the specific commendation hardly mattered. What mattered was the moment when Admiral Hartley stepped back and invited her to address the crowd. Emily walked to the microphone, looking out at the sea of faces, and spoke from the heart. I spent 7 months invisible, she said. I mopped floors and changed bedpans and let people treat me like I did not matter. And you know what I learned? That the invisible people are everywhere. They are the janitors who notice when equipment is malfunctioning. They are the night nurses who catch medication errors. They are the techs and the orderlies and the volunteers who keep hospitals running while the doctors get the credit. She paused, letting the words sink in. Every person matters. Every job matters. The surgeon and the janitor, the admiral and the corpsman, the patient and the person who cleans their room. We are all connected. We all depend on each other. And the moment we forget that, the moment we start treating some people as less worthy of respect than others, we lose something essential about what it means to be human. She looked at the medal on her chest, then back at the audience. This award is not for me. It is for Lieutenant Daniel Webb, who taught me that giving up is never an option. It is for the 17 operators I saved in Kandahar and the 2 I could not. It is for Ryan Mitchell, who is alive today, because his teammates refused to abandon him, and because I remembered the most important lesson Danny ever taught me. Her voice caught slightly, but she pushed through. There is always one more to save. There is always someone who needs help. And as long as that is true, none of us have the right to quit. She stepped back from the microphone to thunderous applause, but she barely heard it. She was looking at the back of the room where a young man in a wheelchair had just been pushed through the doors by a pretty brunette, who was crying and laughing at the same time. Ryan Mitchell. He was alive. He was here. And he was looking at her with an expression that said everything words could not. Emily walked through the crowd toward him, the applause fading into background noise. When she reached him, she knelt down so they were at eye level, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. You came, she said finally. I had to. His voice was weak, but his eyes were bright. I had to say thank you. I had to see the person who would not let me die. Emily took his hand, feeling the warmth of living flesh, the pulse of a heart that had stopped on her operating table and started again because she had refused to give up. You did most of the work, she said. I just reminded you what you were fighting for. Brian smiled, then turned to the brunette beside him. Chief Hayes, this is Sarah, my fiancée. Sarah extended a trembling hand, tears still streaming down her face. I do not know how to thank you, she managed. I do not know the words. Emily stood and embraced her, holding tight. To the woman whose future had been saved along with Ryan's. You do not need words, she said. Just live. Live well. That is all the thanks I need. Later that night, after the ceremony had ended, and the crowds had dispersed, Emily stood alone on the balcony of the Fairmont, looking out at the Boston skyline. The city sparkled beneath her millions of lights, representing millions of lives, each one precious, each one worth saving. Her phone buzzed in her clutch, a text from an unknown number. New assignment available. Your choice. She read it twice, then looked up at the stars that were just becoming visible above the city lights. She thought about Danny, about Ryan, about all the ones who had come before, and all the ones who were yet to come. She thought about the peace she had been chasing for 3 years, and the realization that peace was not something you found by hiding. Peace was something you made by doing the work that mattered, by saving the lives that could be saved, by honoring the ones that could not. She typed her response. I am in. When do I start? Then she put the phone away and smiled at the darkness, feeling something she had not felt in a very long time. Hope. 6 months after the ceremony at the Fairmont St. Michael's Memorial Hospital was barely recognizable to anyone who had known it before. The changes had started small. A new policy requiring all staff to address each other by name regardless of position. A mentorship program pairing senior doctors with junior nurses. A weekly forum where anyone from the chief of surgery to the newest janitor could raise concerns without fear of retaliation. But the real change was something harder to quantify. It was in the way people treated each other in the hallways, the way conversations paused to include everyone present instead of just the people with impressive titles. It was in the absence of the casual cruelty that had once defined the department's culture. They called it the Hayes Standard, though Emily had nothing to do with creating it. The staff had developed it themselves, inspired by a woman who had proven that invisible people were often the most important ones. in the room. Margaret Chen had been promoted to Director of Nursing, a position she had been qualified for decades ago, but had never pursued because she was too busy actually caring for patients. Now she was implementing changes that she had dreamed about for 30 years, and the hospital was better for it. Kevin Park had completed his residency and been offered a position as attending physician at 3 different hospitals. He chose to stay at St. Michael's, where he had become the doctor Emily always knew he could be, the one who defended nurses and listened to patients and remembered that medicine was about people, not prestige. Jessica Holloway had surprised everyone, including herself. The cruel young nurse who had giggled at others' humiliation had transformed into one of the department's most compassionate caregivers. She volunteered for the hardest cases, the ones that other nurses avoided, and she approached each patient with a kindness that seemed to come from someone who understood what it felt like to be dismissed. As for Dr. Jonathan Blake, his medical license remained suspended. The investigation had uncovered years of negligence and falsified records, a pattern of behavior that had somehow been overlooked by everyone who should have been watching. He had taken a position at a small clinic in rural Vermont, starting over from the bottom, learning what it meant to be humble. Emily did not think about him much. He was not worth the energy. The knock on Emily's apartment door came on a Saturday morning in May, when the Boston spring was finally warming into something that felt like hope. She opened it to find Ryan Mitchell standing in her hallway, no longer in a wheelchair, supported by a cane, but standing on his own 2 feet. Beside him was Sarah, her hand resting protectively on the curve of her pregnant belly. "We wanted you to be the first to know," Ryan said, his smile bright enough to light the entire building. "We are having a girl, and we are naming her Emily." Emily stood frozen in her doorway, the words hitting her like a physical blow. She had saved thousands of lives over her career, had received medals and commendations, and thank you letters from people she barely remembered. But this was something different. This was a future that would not have existed without her. "I almost missed this," Ryan said, his voice thick with emotion. "The wedding, the baby, growing old, telling stories to my grandkids about the time I almost died in a place I cannot even talk about." He reached out and took her hand. "You gave me this. All of it." Emily finally found her voice. "You fought for it. I just helped. You brought me back from the dead. I was gone, and you would not let me stay gone." Ryan's eyes were wet, but his gaze was steady. "I am going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that gift. I am going to teach my daughter about sacrifice and courage, and never giving up. And I am going to tell her about the woman who refused to let her father die." Sarah stepped forward and embraced Emily, holding tight with the strength of someone who had almost lost everything and understood exactly how precious second chances were. "Thank you," Sarah whispered. "Thank you for giving me my family." Emily held her back, feeling the warmth of new life between them, feeling the weight of purpose that had seemed so elusive for so long. "Take care of each other," she said when they finally pulled apart. "That is all I ask." She watched them walk away, hand in hand, heading toward a future bright with possibility. And she finally understood what Danny had been trying to tell her all along. The ones you save do not just survive. They go on to create lives and families and legacies of their own. Every person saved is a ripple that spreads outward, forever touching lives that would never exist otherwise. The weight of the lost would never fully disappear, but it was balanced now by something lighter. The wings of the saved. Emily stood at the nurses' station of St. Michael's Emergency Department, wearing scrubs that fit properly. Now her blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, a cup of decent coffee warming her hands. It was 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, the graveyard shift, the hour when the hospital felt most like itself. She was here as a per diem nurse, picking up shifts when she was not consulting for the Navy, or training the next generation of combat medics at the Special Warfare Medical School in Virginia. She had found a way to be both versions of herself, the warrior and the healer, the woman who could save lives in impossible conditions, and the woman who could find peace in the quiet moments between crises. A new nurse stood by the supply closet, young and nervous, looking at the chaos of the ER with wide, overwhelmed eyes. The other staff bustled past her, without acknowledgement, too busy with their own work to notice her uncertainty. Emily set down her coffee and walked over. "First night?" she asked gently. The young woman nodded, looking like she might cry. "I do not know if I can do this. It is so much. Everyone seems to know exactly what to do, and I feel like I do not belong here. Emily smiled, remembering a version of herself that felt the same way once. What is your name? Amanda. Well, Amanda, I am going to tell you something that someone should have told me a long time ago. She put a hand on the young nurse's shoulder. You belong here. You earned your place. And the fact that you are nervous just means you understand how important this work is. She handed Amanda her coffee cup. First night is the hardest. It gets easier. And whenever you feel invisible, whenever you feel like nobody sees you, remember this. The quiet ones in the corner are often the most important people in the room. Amanda took the coffee with trembling hands, but she was smiling now. Thank you. That actually helps. Good. Emily turned back toward the trauma bay where the monitors were beeping and the phones were ringing and lives were waiting to be saved. Now come on, I will show you where everything is. Outside the windows, a helicopter passed over the hospital, its rotors beating against the night sky. Emily looked up at the sound, but she did not flinch. She just smiled at the darkness and whispered words that only she could hear. I know, Danny. Always one more. Then she walked into the light of the trauma bay, ready for whatever came next. And that is the story of Emily Hayes, the quiet nurse everyone ignored, until a Navy helicopter came for their SEAL Combat Pro. She proved that heroes do not always wear capes or carry weapons. Sometimes they wear scrubs and carry stethoscopes. Sometimes they mop floors and empty bedpans. Sometimes they hide in plain sight, waiting for the moment when everything falls apart and someone needs to hold it together. The next time you walk into a hospital, take a moment to look around. Look at the janitor pushing the mop in the corner. Look at the aide refilling the supply cart. Look at the nurse sitting quietly at the station, watching everything with eyes that seem to see more than they should. You never know who they really are. You never know what battles they have fought, what lives they have saved, what sacrifices they have made. And maybe, just maybe, that quiet person you have been ignoring is the most extraordinary one in the room. So here is my question for you. Who is the invisible person in your life? The coworker you walk past without saying hello. The neighbor you have never really talked to. The family member whose story you have never asked about. What would happen if you took a moment to really see them? If this story moved you, if it made you think about the invisible heroes in your own life, please hit that like button. It really does help this channel grow and tells me you want more stories like this one. And if you have not already, make sure you subscribe and tap that notification bell so you never miss a new story. We post new content every week. Stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Stories about courage and sacrifice and the power of never giving up. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Share it with someone who feels invisible. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that they matter. Because you do matter, every single one of you. There is always one more to save. There is always someone who needs help. And sometimes that someone is the person looking back at you in the mirror. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being here. And remember, the quiet ones in the corner are often the most important people in the room. I will see you in the next story.